Hey everybody, I just wanted to share a quick video with you about my favorite way to save paint when you're oil painting. So before we get into the actual steps, I'd like to talk a little bit about how oil paint dries. So oil paint basically will dry if oxygen is touching it. Now, if there's no oxygen touching the oil paint, it won't dry. So one of the first things that we can do when we're trying to keep oil paint from drying out is get as much oxygen away from it. Keep as minimal amount of oxygen from touching the paint as you can. That's why the paint stays so long in the paint tubes, because there's so little oxygen touching it. And especially the modern metal paint tubes, there's very little oxygen, if any, that can get through the metal in those tubes, so they last a very, very long time. So the other thing that affects drying of oil paint, if oxygen is touching it, it will dry faster if it's warmer and slower if it's colder. So if there's oxygen touching it, the lower the temperature, the slower it will dry. So we can combine those two things and we can keep oil paint pretty wet for a pretty long time. And there's a number of ways you can do this, but I'll show you my favorite because it's very quick. And it also happens to be environmentally friendly because we save, I don't think save maybe not the right word, but we reuse a little bit of plastic, which is a great practice. So I'll show you the supplies that you would need. First of all, of course, you'd need some paint that you want to save. Say you spent some time mixing up a paint and you want to save it before you start painting, or maybe you started painting and you have just the perfect color and you ended up mixing up a bunch of it and you don't want to waste it. Or, if you use big piles of paint on the edge of your palette and it's the end of the night and you want to save those piles, then this can be a good technique. So besides the paint, we also need a roll of tape. The exact tape doesn't matter too much. You just don't want it to be too thick. This, I believe, is 3/4 of an inch, possibly 5/8, but the exact width doesn't matter. You want a palette knife to pick up your paint with. You're going to need a marker to label your paint and scissors just to cut up the plastic. And you're going to need some plastic. And I'll talk a little bit about the plastic that works well for this. So what you want to look for is you want to look for plastic that is stretchy and not crinkly, and also that doesn't tear easily. It's about the same consistency as plastic wrap for food, but if you watch for bags for packaging, you'll find that you can get some that's quite a bit thicker than the plastic wrap you buy for food and works a lot better. I find when it has the recycling number 4, it's often good plastic, although it's not. Sometimes I find bags that have a different number or no number, and you can still sort of feel what is the right kind of plastic. Now, our first step that we're going to do is we want to cut a square of this plastic. And I'd say you want to aim for, maybe 3 times the size of the pile of paint that you are going to try and save. So I'm going to use my scissors now and just cut a square, sort of approximating that size. Doesn't have to be a perfect square. And you want to err probably on the side of being a little too big rather than too small. Because if you're too small, the paint you'll see is actually going to sort of squeeze out as you're packing this paint up. So let's see, I got this paint this size here, which is hopefully big enough. I think it should be okay. So what we do is we take our paint and we put it in about the center of our piece of plastic. Maybe somewhere about there. And now what I do is I fold the plastic in half. And so we've got this ball of paint over here. And again, what we want to do now is try and get as much oxygen away from the paint. I can see there's a little air bubble in here, a little hard to see on the camera. But there's a little air bubble in here, so I'm just sort of squishing it around and pinching until that air bubble is gone. And I'm not trying to flatten it here, I'm trying to actually sort of squish it into, again, a ball shape. Because there's always going to be a little bit of air that gets in here, but the more that's in a big ball in the center, that's going to be less likely to have air touching it. So once I've got it sort of pinched into the center, I can just sort of keep pinching until I've got it all together like this, and I can hold it, and I've got sort of this little pouch where the paint is. And I've got this now, this big tail of plastic here. What I can do is just take this and twist. And I've got now this little pouch, which for some reason just struck me as the old snap caps. It looks kind of like those little snap cap toys. Little, I guess they're sort of a firecracker. And next you want to take a piece of tape. About, maybe close to 2 inches. The exact length doesn't matter. And you're gonna just fold this over where you twisted, and you want to get it as close to the paint as you can without sort of squishing it too much, because again, we want to keep that oxygen away from that paint. And now we've got this little flag on here, which does two things. It lets us, it seals up our little pouch, and also it lets us write a little bit, make a little notes about what this color is. So I can write some notes to myself that, maybe this is, if I'm painting an apple, maybe this is the lightest red color on the apple. So this might be, my red light, my apple light color. And I also often just on the back of this make a few quick notes about which paints I use to mix this. So I'll just put in here that this was made with quinacridone magenta, bismuth yellow, and raw umber. All right, so that's our little pouch. And this is great. This will keep the paint pretty wet for a decent amount of time. I haven't tested exactly how long it'll work like this. Now, remember how we talked about oil paint, how oil paint dries. Now, what this does is this keeps a good amount of oxygen away from the paint, so it really slows down the drying. There's always going to be a little bit that gets in there, so this won't last as long for sure as in a metal paint tube, but it'll last a while. If you want to slow it down even more, you can put this in some kind of container and stick it in a freezer, because we can make it as cold as possible. That little bit that's going to be drying is going to be as slow as possible, and it will last for weeks this way. Now, when you do put it in the freezer, You may find that before you can paint with it, you need to let it thaw out. It's never going to freeze totally, but it gets a little thick. And you just take it out half an hour before you need to paint, and it should be good to go. Now, how do you use this? Well, you're not going to open this back up because that would be horribly messy. So what we can do actually is just take a thumbtack and poke a little hole in here. And then we can squeeze out just a tiny bit of paint at a time, which is quite wonderful. It's another way to say, another advantage to saving paint this way. And now there's a little hole in this. So that's going to allow oxygen, a tiny bit of oxygen, to touch our paint. So I'm going to just rip a tiny piece of tape off, and I'm going to just clean off as a quick wipe on my paper towel to clean off the paint that's on the outside of this. And I'm just going to use this piece of tape just to seal up that little hole. And there you have it. This little pouch, great way to save paint. Hope that's helpful for you.